The tractor sitting in the back of your grandfather's shed, the one with the cracked seat and the faded green paint, can do something the newest John Deere on the lot cannot. It can be fixed by the man who owns it. No dealer authorization, no diagnostic software, no laptop connected to a port hidden beneath the dash. A wrench, a service manual, and an afternoon. That was not a feature. It was a philosophy. And for most of the 20th century, it was the only philosophy John Deere knew. What replaced it was not progress. It was a different kind of engineering entirely. The Waterloo, Iowa manufacturing floor in the years after the Second World War carried a particular atmosphere. The smell of cutting oil hung in the air above the assembly lines. Cast iron components moved from station to station on chains, each one machined to tolerances that assumed the piece would be inspected, adjusted, and rebuilt decades into the future. The tractors coming off that line, the two-cylinder machines designated the Model A, the Model B, the Model G, and the series that followed, were built around a set of assumptions that never appeared in any brochure. The farmer who bought the machine would own it for 20 or 30 years. He would maintain it himself. He would hand it to a son. Engineering decisions were made with that lifespan as the baseline, not as an aspiration. The two-cylinder architecture made that possible. Fewer moving parts meant fewer failure points. Operating speeds in the range of 1,100 to 1,400 revolutions per minute meant reduced mechanical stress across a working life measured in decades rather than seasons. Cylinder sleeves were replaceable in the field, meaning a worn bore could be restored to factory specification without replacing the block. Magneto ignition systems could be serviced with tools found in any farm shop. Roller and ball bearing specifications remained consistent across model years, which meant a part sourced in 1962 would fit a machine built a decade earlier. They stopped building tractors for the man who would fix them and started building them for the man who would finance them. But that sentence belongs to a later chapter. In Waterloo in the 1950s, the man who would fix them was the only man they were building for. A retired assembly worker from that era recalled it simply. Every machine that left the line was expected to come back for service, not for replacement. The machine was not the product. The relationship was. The new generation arrived in 1960 at a demonstration in Dallas, Texas, that the industry has never forgotten. John Deere revealed an entirely new line of 4- and 6-cylinder tractors in a single afternoon, erasing 2 decades of two-cylinder identity without warning. The engineering was genuine. The 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder platforms delivered power outputs the previous line could not approach. The 4010 diesel produced approximately 84 horsepower at the power takeoff shaft, a figure that, in 1960, represented a meaningful leap beyond what a comparable machine could accomplish the previous year. The new transmissions, the synchro range, and eventually the power shift were gear-driven assemblies with published torque specifications and dealer rebuild kits available through the parts system. The hydraulics were improved. The operator platform was more refined. None of this was cosmetic. By most engineering measures, the new generation was a better machine than what it replaced. What it preserved was the philosophy. Engine blocks still carried replaceable wet sleeves. Final drive housings were cast iron. Service manuals were written for the farm shop, not the dealership. A competent mechanic with the right manual could perform a complete top-end engine rebuild on a 4020 in a day. A veteran dealer service manager from that period described it without sentiment. The manual told you what to do and assumed you were capable of doing it. That assumption was the entire relationship between Deere and the men who ran its equipment. In 1968, in a farm shop somewhere in Iowa, a farmer and his son could remove an engine hood, set a feeler gauge against a valve stem, and work through an adjustment that would extend the machine's useful life by another several years. The cost was an afternoon and the price of a gasket set. That shop, that afternoon, that transaction between a farmer and his own machine, it would not survive the decade that followed. The farm crisis of the early 1980s did not announce itself. It arrived through the back door of a decade that had promised abundance. Land values across the Midwest had inflated dramatically through the 1970s as grain prices rose and exports expanded. Farmers borrowed against appreciated land to buy equipment. Equipment manufacturers financed that equipment through their own credit operations. The system was circular. In 1979 and 1980, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to combat inflation, driving farm borrowing costs above 20%, a figure that, for a farmer carrying a substantial equipment note, could represent more than his entire operating margin for the year. Land values collapsed. In some Midwestern counties, farmland that had been appraised at several $1,000s per acre fell by as much as 60%. John Deere reported operating losses during the worst years of the crisis, losses that marked the first time in decades the company had bled in its core business. A farm equipment dealer from the upper Midwest described watching the crisis from his lot. Farmers walking away from loans and machines in the same week. Showrooms that had moved a dozen tractors a season sitting empty. The phone calls about financing that nobody could approve anymore. The crisis passed. John Deere survived it. Several competitors did not survive it as cleanly. But survival required a restructuring, and restructuring required a new center of gravity. John Deere Financial, the company's credit arm, moved from supporting sales to generating profit in its own right. The implications of that shift were not visible on the assembly line. They were visible in the questions the finance division began asking the engineering division. Not what will last longest, but what will cost least to produce and most to repair when it fails. They stopped building tractors for the man who would fix them and started building them for the man who would finance them. That sentence, which had once been unthinkable in Waterloo, had become company policy. The electronics arrived with genuine justification. Emissions regulations imposed by the Environmental Protection Agency, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and finally Tier 4 final, placed real engineering constraints on diesel combustion systems. Common rail fuel injection, diesel particulate filters, selective catalytic reduction systems. These were not inventions of corporate strategy. They were responses to documented public health consequences of uncontrolled diesel exhaust. The engineering was necessary. What was not necessary was the proprietary architecture built around it. An injection pump on a 1970s Deere could be timed with a timing light and adjusted with hand tools. The timing specification was in the service manual. The service manual was available to anyone. A common rail piezoelectric injection system on a current production machine requires factory calibration software to set injection timing, duration, and rail pressure. That software, distributed under the name Service Advisor, is licensed to dealers, not sold to owners. A diesel particulate filter in regeneration cycle cannot be manually initiated on certain models without an authorization code from that same system. An independent diesel mechanic put it without bitterness. It was not that he lacked the knowledge. The access was simply not available to him. The machine had been designed to require a permission that only one class of people could grant. The farm shop where a father and son had once spent an afternoon was now a liability in a business model that depended on service revenue remaining inside the dealer network. The physical evidence is measurable. Not a marketing claim, not a matter of nostalgia, but a specification. Final drive housings on mid-century Deere equipment were cast iron, machined to tolerances that assumed the component would be disassembled, inspected, and returned to service. Current production equivalents on certain model lines have transitioned to fabricated steel assemblies in some applications. Lighter, faster to manufacture, less expensive per unit, and not designed for the same rebuilding cycle. Grease-serviceable bearings, which allowed a farmer to maintain a lubrication schedule with a hand grease gun, were reduced or eliminated on several model lines in favor of sealed assemblies that require full replacement when worn. A restoration specialist who works exclusively on pre-1980 Deere equipment described holding the final drive gear from a machine built in 1967 against one from a machine built decades later. The older piece, after a working life measured in tens of thousands of hours, still carried true surfaces and consistent wall thickness at the web. The newer piece had been manufactured to a different standard. Not a fraudulent one, but a standard that had asked a different question. Not how long will this last, but how much does this cost? The machines had stopped being built for the man who would fix them the moment the company discovered that the man who financed them would pay again to have them fixed. The argument formalized in legislatures across the country in the early 2020s. Right to repair legislation, introduced in Missouri, Nebraska, Colorado, and other states, attempted to compel manufacturers to provide independent repair access to the diagnostic software that farmers had effectively lost. John Deere lobbied against several of those bills. In January of 2023, the company signed a memorandum of understanding with the American Farm Bureau Federation, promising expanded repair access by 2025. Whether that agreement has produced meaningful change remains actively contested. Farmer advocacy groups have reported that practical access to diagnostic software remains restricted for many independent repair operations. The collector market has drawn its own conclusion. Well-maintained examples of the 4020, the 4430, and the 4640, tractors built before the proprietary turn, have in documented auction cases sold for figures that approach or exceed their original purchase price, adjusted for inflation. The market for machines that can be fixed by the people who own them has not disappeared. It has simply become a market for machines that are no longer in production. The tractor in the grandfather's shed still starts. The seat is cracked. The paint is faded to a color somewhere between green and memory. Everything inside it was built to be understood by the man who owned it. Every lubrication point accessible, every tolerance published, every component designed to be removed, inspected, and returned to service. That was not a feature of a simpler time. It was a choice made by engineers who believed the owner deserved to know his own machine. What replaced that belief was not progress. It was a decision about where the profit would live. They stopped building tractors for the man who would fix them. The man who would fix them is still waiting.